You look at a reconstruction of a Neanderthal face, you see the heavy brow ridge, you see the long, low skull, and you definitely see the nose. It's huge. It's not just the fleshy part either. The whole middle of their face projects forward. The bone structure underneath, the nasal opening in the skull, is massive compared to ours. It's one of their most defining features. And the question is simple. Why? Why did Neanderthals have such big noses? The answer isn't simple. There isn't one single, universally accepted reason. Instead, there are a few competing ideas. And the truth is probably a mix of all of them. But to understand these ideas, we first have to understand who the Neanderthals were and the world they lived in. They weren't brutish cavemen. They were a successful and long-lasting lineage of humans. They lived across a huge swath of Eurasia, from Portugal to Siberia, and they were around for hundreds of thousands of years, much longer than we, Homo sapiens, have been. They survived through multiple ice ages. Their world was often cold, colder than ours. It was also drier. Think of the air in winter. It's cold and it sucks the moisture out of everything, including your throat and lungs. This environment is the backdrop for the whole story. The first and most famous theory is about that cold, dry air. It's called the cold adaptation hypothesis. The idea is that their large nose was a personal air conditioning unit. But instead of cooling air down, it was designed to warm it up and moisten it. Breathing and freezing dry air is bad for you. It's a shock to the sensitive tissues deep inside your lungs. It can cause damage and make you more susceptible to respiratory infections. If you're a Neanderthal, living a physically demanding life in a prehistoric world, getting a bad lung infection could be a death sentence. So, any trait that helped prevent that would be a huge advantage. Here's how it might have worked. A large nose means a large internal nasal cavity. There's a lot of space inside. This space is lined with mucous membranes, which are full of tiny blood vessels called capillaries. When a Neanderthal took a breath of frigid air, it didn't just go straight down into the lungs. It first entered this big, warm, moist chamber. As the air swirled around inside the nose, it would have been warmed by the blood flowing just beneath the surface of the membranes. It's like a radiator for your face. At the same time, moisture from those mucous membranes would evaporate into the dry air, humidifying it. By the time the air reached the back of the throat on its way to the lungs, it was no longer freezing and dry. It was warm and moist. It was much safer for the lungs. This theory makes a lot of sense on the surface. Neanderthals lived in the cold. Big noses could warm cold air. It seems like a perfect example of natural selection at work. For a long time, this was the textbook explanation, but science is about testing ideas, not just accepting them because they sound good. And when scientists looked closer, they found some problems. They started looking at modern humans who live in cold climates like the Inuit of the Arctic or people from Siberia. If the big nose theory was correct, you'd expect these people to have wide Neanderthal-like noses. But they don't. In fact, they tend to have the opposite. They often have relatively tall, narrow nasal passages. This was a major blow to the simple cold adaptation idea. Research on fluid dynamics, how air flows through different shapes, suggested that a narrow passage can be more effective at warming and moistening air. It creates more turbulence and forces the air to have more contact with the nasal walls. So, if the goal was just to warm the air, a narrow, high nose might actually be better than a wide, projecting one. This suggests that warming cold air probably wasn't the main reason for the Neanderthal nose shape. It might have been a side benefit, but it likely wasn't the primary driving force behind its evolution. This led scientists to look for another explanation, and the next big idea had less to do with the temperature of the air and more to do with the amount of it. This is the high energy demands hypothesis. Think about the Neanderthal lifestyle. They were not sedentary. They were active hunters. Their skeletons tell us they were incredibly muscular and robust. They were built for power. Their bones were thicker than ours. The places where muscles attached to the bones are huge, indicating they had massive muscle mass. They were hunting large animals like mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant deer. This was not a casual activity. It would have involved intense bursts of energy. Stalking prey, then maybe a short, explosive chase or a close quarters confrontation. On top of that, just staying alive in a cold climate requires a ton of energy. Your body is constantly burning calories just to maintain its core temperature. A Neanderthal's body was like a furnace, and that furnace needed a constant supply of fuel and oxygen. Their metabolic rate, the speed at which they burned energy, was likely much higher than ours. Some estimates suggest they needed over 4,000 calories a day just to get by, and probably more. All of this activity and this high metabolism requires a massive amount of oxygen. And how do you get more oxygen into your body? You breathe in more air. The Neanderthal nose, with its huge nasal opening, might have been the solution. It was a high flow intake valve. Imagine trying to breathe through a narrow straw versus a wide pipe. You could pull a lot more air, a lot more quickly, through the wide pipe. The large nasal aperture of a Neanderthal skull suggests they could take in huge volumes of air with every breath. This would have been essential during strenuous activity, allowing them to oxygenate their powerful muscles and sustain high levels of exertion without having to switch to panting through their mouth. Mouth breathing is less efficient, and in cold air, it bypasses that nasal warming system entirely. So, this theory suggests the big nose wasn't about the quality of the air at its temperature, but about the quantity. It was about getting as much oxygen as possible to fuel a demanding, high-energy lifestyle in a challenging environment. This idea fits well with the rest of their anatomy. Their chests were huge and barrel-shaped, suggesting they had enormous lung capacity to go along with their big noses. The whole system, from the nose to the lungs to the muscles, seems designed for power and high performance. It presents a more complete picture of Neanderthal physiology. The nose wasn't just a weird facial feature, it was part of the engine that powered the whole body. But there's a third possibility, one that's a bit more complex. It suggests that the big nose wasn't an adaptation for anything in particular. It might have just been a byproduct of other things, or it could have been the result of random chance. This is the idea of genetic drift and what are sometimes called architectural constraints. Evolution doesn't always produce perfect, optimized solutions for specific problems. Sometimes features arise for reasons that have nothing to do with their eventual function. Let's start with genetic drift. This is a powerful force in evolution, especially in small populations. Natural selection is about survival of the fittest. The best traits get passed on. Genetic drift is just about random luck. Imagine a small, isolated group of Neanderthals. Just by chance, the individuals who happen to have slightly bigger noses might have more children. Not because the big nose helped them survive, but just because that's how it worked out. A couple of them might have been lucky in a hunt, or avoided an accident. Over many generations in a small population, this random chance can cause a trait, like a big nose, to become common throughout the entire group. So it's possible the Neanderthal nose started to get big simply by chance, not because it provided any specific advantage. The other part of this idea is about the overall structure of the skull. A feature might exist not because it's useful, but because it's the necessary consequence of another feature. Think of building a house. The shape of the attic is determined by the pitch of the roof. You didn't design the attic to be triangular, it just ended up that way because of how you built the roof. In the case of the Neanderthal skull, one interesting idea relates to their teeth. Neanderthal fossils show extreme wear on their front teeth, the incisors. It looks like they were using their mouths as a third hand. Maybe for gripping hides while scraping them, or holding a piece of wood while carving it. This is called anterior dental loading, putting a lot of stress on the front teeth. To support these powerful front teeth and a strong bite, you need a robust jaw and a facial structure that can handle that stress. This might have caused the entire mid-facial region to shift forward and become more massive. If you pull the whole tooth-bearing part of the face forward, the nose, which sits right in the middle of it, is going to come along for the ride. In this scenario, the big nose isn't the point. The point is having a strong, stable facial structure to support the use of the teeth as tools. The large projecting nose is just the attic space, an architectural byproduct of building a different kind of face. It didn't evolve for breathing or for warming air. It just evolved as part of a package of features related to their jaw and teeth. So now we have three different stories. The nose as a climate-controlled device, the nose as a supercharger for a high-performance body, and the nose as an accidental byproduct of other facial changes or pure random chance. Which one is right? The most likely answer is that they all are to some extent. These theories aren't mutually exclusive. It's very rare in evolution that a complex feature has only one single cause. It's more likely a combination of pressures and constraints working together. Perhaps the story went something like this. Maybe the initial driver was in fact the need for a more robust facial structure to handle stresses on the front teeth. This caused the whole mid-face to project forward, creating a larger nasal cavity as a byproduct. This is our architectural starting point. Now, you have a population of early Neanderthals with these slightly bigger noses. They are living in a cold climate and leading a very active lifestyle. At this point, natural selection can start to act on this new feature. Even if a bigger nose isn't the best possible design for warming air, it's probably better than a smaller one. It provides more surface area, so individuals with slightly larger internal nasal structures might have had a small advantage. They might have gotten sick a little less often. This is the cold adaptation part. It might not have been the original reason for the nose, but it became a useful secondary benefit. At the same time, these Neanderthals need a lot of oxygen for their energetic lives. That big nasal opening, which came along with the projecting face, turned out to be fantastic for pulling in huge volumes of air. Individuals who could breathe more efficiently could hunt more effectively. They could sustain exertion longer. This provided a huge survival advantage. This is the high energy demands part. This pressure would have strongly favored an even larger, more open airway. So, you can see how these factors could weave together. A change in one part of the skull of the jaw creates a new feature, a bigger nose. This new feature happens to be pretty good for breathing in large amounts of air, which is a huge benefit for their lifestyle. So, selection favors making it even better for that purpose. And as a minor side benefit, it also helps a bit with the cold, dry air. Genetic drift could have been mixed in there too, pushing the trait in one direction or another in different isolated groups. What we're left with is not a simple answer, but a complex and dynamic story of evolution. The Neanderthal nose wasn't just one thing, it was a multi-tool. It was a consequence of their ancestry, a solution to their energy needs, and a partial buffer against their environment. When we look at a Neanderthal skull, it's easy to see it as something alien or primitive. We focus on the differences, the brow, the chinless jaw, the big nose, but each of those features tells a story about a different way of being human. Their faces were the product of hundreds of thousands of years of survival in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. The large midface wasn't just about the nose, it was part of an entire facial structure that was different from ours. Their cheekbones were swept back, not prominent and forward-facing like ours. This created a kind of puffy appearance in the middle of the face. This whole design was integrated. The nose, the teeth, the cheeks, the brow ridge, they all worked together. It was a functional, successful design that served them well for an incredibly long time. We, Homo sapiens, have a different facial structure. We have flatter faces, more delicate jaws, smaller noses, and pointy chins. Our design is not inherently better, it's just different. It's the result of our own unique evolutionary journey, which took place mostly in warmer climates with different dietary and behavioral pressures. The question on the Neanderthal nose is a perfect example of how science works. An observation leads to a simple hypothesis: it was for the cold. More data comes in and complicates the hypothesis. Modern cold-adapted people have different noses. New hypotheses are proposed. It was for breathing large volumes of air, or it was an architectural byproduct. And eventually, a more nuanced synthesis emerges that combines elements of all the ideas. The debate is still ongoing. New studies on Neanderthal genetics and new fossil discoveries could still change our understanding. But for now, the best answer to why did Neanderthals have such big noses is that they were a key part of a powerful, high-energy body. They were the intake for a biological engine built for survival in the Ice Age. They were a feature shaped by the demands of their powerful jaws, the need for vast amounts of oxygen, the constant pressure of the cold, and the random hand of genetic chance. Their nose wasn't a strange, isolated flaw. It was the centerpiece of a face and a body that was perfectly, or at least very successfully, adapted to its time and place. It's a reminder that there is more than one way to be human.